Imagine losing your job because a government decided it needed to save money. Now imagine that decision eventually helping put an unemployed worker on the road to rebellion, and that rebellion eventually bringing down a dynasty that had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries. It sounds impossible, but this is the strange story of Li Zicheng, the Ming Dynasty, and a controversial story about one official, his wife, and an imperial postal system. And according to one famous account, it all began with a family scandal. A husband took a second wife. His wife found out, and she chased him all the way to Beijing. Then the postal system was cut, and somewhere along that chain of events was a man named Li Zicheng. Years later, he would enter Beijing at the head of a rebel army, and the emperor of the Ming Dynasty would hang himself from a tree. So, how did we get from a cheating husband to the collapse of a dynasty? Let's go back to the beginning. The story takes place during the final decades of the Ming Dynasty. The Ming had ruled China since 1368. For centuries, it had survived wars, rebellions, invasions, economic crises, and political struggles. But by the early 17th century, the empire was under enormous pressure. The government needed money. A lot of money. On the northern frontier, the Manchu state was becoming increasingly powerful. Ming armies needed weapons, soldiers, horses, food, and supplies. At the same time, many parts of China were suffering from droughts, floods, crop failures, and famine. The population had grown dramatically over the previous centuries, but land and resources had not grown at the same speed. For ordinary farmers, life could become desperate very quickly. If the harvest failed, a family might not have enough food. If taxes were still demanded, the situation became even worse. And if a farmer lost his land, he could become a migrant, a beggar, a bandit, or a rebel. Meanwhile, the government itself was running short of money. The Ming Dynasty had a massive administrative system, and one of the most important parts of that system was something most modern people would probably think of as a kind of ancient postal service: the imperial relay system. The Chinese imperial postal network was far more than a place for sending letters. It was a huge transportation and communication system. Across the empire were thousands of relay stations. Officials traveling on government business could use them. Imperial messengers could change horses. Government documents could move from one province to another. Supplies and people could be transported. The system allowed the central government to communicate across an enormous empire long before telephones, trains, or modern roads existed. But such a system was expensive. Every station needed buildings. It needed horses. It needed food and fodder. It needed workers. It needed maintenance. And it needed people to keep everything moving. The men who worked in this system were called relay workers, or Yicheng. They were not powerful officials. They were ordinary people working for the state. And one of these men was a young man from Shaanxi. His name was Li Zicheng. Li Zicheng was born into a poor family in Shaanxi. He did not begin his life as a revolutionary. He was not a prince. He was not a general. He was not a political theorist. He was simply a man trying to survive. At one point, he worked as a postal relay worker. His job connected him to the enormous machinery of the Ming state. But the state that employed him was itself struggling to survive. The government began looking for ways to reduce spending. And this is where our strange story begins. During the early years of the Chongzhen Emperor's reign, the Ming government began considering reforms to reduce the enormous cost of the relay system. One official associated with the proposal was Liu Mao. According to a famous later account, however, there was a much more personal story behind his interest in reform. And this is where history becomes almost unbelievable. The story says that Liu Mao had taken a concubine. His wife discovered what he had done. She was furious. Instead of quietly accepting the situation, she decided to go after her husband. And how did she travel? According to the story, she used the imperial relay system. She traveled from the provinces toward Beijing, using the very network that allowed officials and government messengers to move across the empire. Imagine the scene. A husband thinks he has escaped his domestic troubles. Then one day, his wife arrives in Beijing. She has traveled hundreds of miles using the empire's own transportation network, and she is there to confront him. According to the story, Liu Mao became angry at the abuse and expense of the relay system, and he supported cutting it back. It is a wonderful story. It is also a dangerous story for a historian, because we need to separate the story from what we can actually establish. The reform of the Ming relay system is real. Liu Mao was a real official. The government really did move to reduce and reorganize the relay system. And Li Zicheng really had worked in the relay system. But the idea that Liu Mao proposed cutting the system specifically because his wife chased him to Beijing is much harder to establish. It appears in later historical storytelling and has become a famous explanation for the reform. But historians should be careful. There is a difference between saying, "This happened," and saying, "This is the story people later told about why it happened." And that distinction matters. Because the real reason the Ming government wanted to cut the relay system was much less romantic. It was running out of money. The Chongzhen emperor inherited an enormous crisis. He came to the throne in 1627, when he was only a young man. He was determined to save the dynasty. He tried to fight corruption. He changed officials. He demanded greater efficiency. He looked for ways to reduce waste. And the relay system became an obvious target. Some stations were inefficient. Some officials abused the system. Government resources were being wasted. The state believed it could save money by eliminating unnecessary stations and reducing personnel. On paper, this made sense. But government reforms have consequences, especially when they happen during a social crisis. For the people working in the system, reform did not mean efficiency. It meant unemployment. And among those workers was Li Zicheng. When relay stations were abolished or reduced, many relay workers lost their livelihoods. Li Zicheng was one of them. Suddenly, a man who had worked for the imperial government no longer had a government job, and he was living in Shanxi. This was one of the areas suffering badly from economic hardship and natural disasters. The loss of a job could be devastating. There was no modern unemployment insurance. There was no government welfare system waiting for him. There was no easy way to find another job. For a poor man, losing his position could mean hunger. And hunger was becoming a major problem across northern China. But Li Zicheng's troubles did not end with unemployment. His life became increasingly unstable. According to traditional accounts, he became involved in debt and legal trouble. Eventually, he joined the growing wave of rebels and bandits moving through the countryside. At first, he was only one man among many. But China's crisis was creating thousands like him. This is the part of the story that is often forgotten. Li Zicheng did not bring down the Ming Dynasty by himself. He emerged from a massive social disaster. Across northern China, farmers were struggling with famine. Some communities were devastated by drought. Others were hit by floods or crop failures. The government still needed taxes, but farmers had less and less ability to pay them. The government needed soldiers, but soldiers needed wages. The government needed money, but the economy was suffering. It was a vicious circle. The more desperate the government became, the more pressure it placed on ordinary people. And the more pressure ordinary people faced, the more people became willing to rebel. Thousands of displaced people joined rebel armies. Some joined because they believed in a cause. Others joined because they were hungry. Many joined because there was simply nowhere else to go. And slowly, the rebellion became a force that the Ming government could no longer control. Li Zicheng proved to be an extraordinary military leader. He was disciplined. He was charismatic. And he understood the anger of ordinary people. He eventually became known as Chuang Wang, the Dashing King, or King Chuang. His army grew. The Ming government tried repeatedly to defeat him. Sometimes it succeeded. Sometimes Li Zicheng was forced to retreat. But the deeper crisis never disappeared. The government could defeat one rebel army. It could not defeat famine. It could not defeat poverty. It could not solve its fiscal crisis. And it could not make the people trust a government that increasingly seemed unable to protect them. Then the situation became even worse. While the Ming government fought rebels inside China, it also faced an increasingly powerful enemy in the north. The Manchu state had developed into a formidable military power. The Ming government had to divide its resources between internal rebellion and external war. This was disastrous. Every soldier sent against rebels was a soldier not defending the northern frontier. Every coin spent on one crisis was a coin unavailable for another. The empire was being pulled apart. And then came the final years. By 1644, the Ming Dynasty was collapsing. Li Zicheng's forces had grown enormously. His army moved toward the capital, Beijing, the same city where, according to the famous story, a furious wife had once arrived through the imperial relay system. Now another traveler was approaching. This time it was not a wife. It was Li Zicheng. And he was not coming alone. He was coming with an army. In April 1644, Li Zicheng's forces entered Beijing. The Ming court was overwhelmed. The Chongzhen emperor realized that the dynasty was finished. He fled toward Jingshan, the hill just north of the Forbidden City. There, according to the traditional account, he ordered his family to disperse. He then took his own life by hanging himself from a tree. The Ming Dynasty had fallen. Now think about the chain of events. A government was trying to save money. It reduced a huge and expensive transportation network. A worker lost his job. That worker entered a world of famine and rebellion. He joined an insurgency. He became a military leader. His army captured the capital. And the emperor who had tried to save his dynasty died as the dynasty collapsed. Was the Ming Dynasty destroyed because the government cut the postal system? No. History is almost never that simple. The Ming fell because of a combination of political failure, financial crisis, war, famine, social unrest, military problems, and the rise of the Manchu power. But the relay reforms were still part of the story. They changed the lives of thousands of ordinary people. And for one of them, they may have changed the course of Chinese history. And perhaps that is why the story of Liu Mao and his wife has survived. Because it gives us something that complicated history usually cannot. A simple chain of cause and effect. A husband takes a concubine. His wife discovers it. She chases him to Beijing. He helps cut the postal system. A worker loses his job. That worker becomes a rebel. And the rebel eventually captures the capital. It sounds almost too perfect. And perhaps it is. The safest conclusion is not that one angry wife caused the fall of the Ming Dynasty. The real lesson is more interesting. A government decision made in the name of efficiency can have consequences far beyond what its creators imagine. The Ming government wanted to save money. Instead, it helped create thousands of unemployed people at exactly the moment when society was least able to absorb them. And somewhere among those people was a former relay worker named Li Zicheng. He would eventually become the man who entered Beijing and helped end the Ming Dynasty. So the next time someone tells you that history is shaped only by emperors and generals, remember the humble postal worker. Sometimes, history begins with someone simply losing his job. And sometimes, the person who loses that job becomes the man who walks through the gates of an empire. This is China Untold Stories. One story at a time.